remakes. They can be bad, they can be good, they can be extremely ill-advised. Today, I'm going to have a meltdown about The Mummy and his various hands, tombs, ghosts, curses, returns, spin-offs, dragon emperors, and completely unnecessary Tom Cruise reboots.
Are you my mummy?
The original film version of The Mummy was released in 1932, and it starred Boris Karloff as the titular character. This was right in the middle of the monster movie craze that had spawned the incredibly popular Dracula and Frankenstein franchises, and would go on to include such icons as the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Invisible Man, the Bride of Frankenstein, which is my personal favorite of all of the Universal monster movies. These movies are all older than my parents, but I grew up watching them and I loved them, and especially Boris Karloff. Unlike its predecessors, Dracula and Frankenstein, The Mummy was not based on an existing novel, and instead had been partially inspired by news stories about the opening of the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922, or otherwise known as King Tut, mashed up with a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, which I don't think they ever gave him credit for, which is a little awkward. An interesting thing to point out here is that while a lot of these other monster movies had direct sequels, the other movies that are generally considered sequels to the 1932 Mummy are technically not. The Mummy's Hand in 1940 is itself sort of a remake of the 1932 film, spawning sequels The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, The Mummy's Curse, and the comedy pseudo-sequel Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy in 1955. Karloff did not return for any of these.
Signed, Boris Karloff, Hollywood, California.
Hammer Films did 4 movies in the 50s and 60s, but those are remakes and sequels to The Mummy's Hand, so they're sort of remakes of a remake, which honestly gets a bit dizzying. Cut to 1999, Universal decides to give a reboot treatment to the original Boris Karloff film. And I have to be honest, I went in prepared to hate it. It was based on something I liked, and everything else that had come from it had been of iffy at best quality, so I didn't have a lot of confidence. But it won me over. It's very different in style and tone from the original source, but I appreciated the way that it worked elements of the original story into something that honestly feels like half Mummy remake and half Indiana Jones tribute. And maybe I'm predisposed to enjoying something that is in that sort of style, with 2 main characters who are a sort of adventurer, archaeologist sort of guy, and a librarian, since my wife used to work as a records librarian, but also in college did archaeological digs. So I kind of like to joke and say that she is my Indiana Jones, because she definitely has an attitude when she sees people steal things from archaeology sites, and has a very "that belongs in a museum" kind of attitude, which I find adorable.
That belongs in a museum!
But I digress completely. As such, in making something that sort of mashes up the classic Mummy story with this sort of big, grand, epic action-adventure feel, it does what a good remake does. It adapts the story, it nods to it, it gives it a spin, though, and doesn't just... It's not like the Psycho remake that was shot-for-shot remake that was just like, why? Why is this happening? And this movie is just fun. Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, Oded Fehr, Arnold Vosloo as a very suitably creepy, imposing Imhotep. They're all doing a great job. I wish there were more actiony adventure type movies like this, and I just feel like it's something that we don't have enough of. And the original film, as much as I really love it, isn't without its flaws. Of the Universal monster movies, it really is one that most benefits from an update. It never feels like this update, though, has anything but love and respect for its origins. If you see any interviews with the writer-director, Stephen Sommers, it's clear that he grew up watching The Mummy, the original one, like I did, and he loved it, and he was just like, how can I do this but make it, like, bigger? And it's deeply important, and probably the aspect that separates a good remake from a bad one is the people who really have a love for their source. Same thing goes for John Carpenter's remake of The Thing. One interesting bit about Mummy 99, and that's not the movie's name, but there are multiple movies just called The Mummy, and I have to differentiate somehow. So, Imhotep and Anck-su-namun had a slight rewrite in this from the original. So in the opening story, they're not really wrong in a sense if you think about it. The pharaoh's demanding that she is his property. She can't be touched by anyone else. She rebels against him wanting her as property, as one does. Anyway, all this to say, my body is no longer his temple is a badass line and doesn't get enough credit. I love that line. Yes, after that, Imhotep is getting into some very murky territory with dark magic and kills a ton of people, but he's doing it for love.
Cool motive, still murder.
I really enjoy heroes who aren't invincible and make mistakes. That's definitely where they go with this, and it's just much more satisfying than a lot of modern action movies where they go with the hero's unstoppable feel. I want flaws, I like them. The Rambo-type hero gets boring to me. Rick O'Connell's very sure of himself, but we as the audience know he's about 50% full of crap, and that makes it work. And I think Brendan Fraser plays that very well. I love some of the weird details, like Imhotep being repelled by cats because Egypt, which is a little goofy, but I like it anyway. I think this may be the only movie I've seen where someone wields a cat as a weapon. And I mean, I'm very allergic, so same dude. The original movie is only about 75 minutes long. The 99 remake does follow the main plot pretty closely in a lot of ways. It just fleshes things out a lot. There are even specific shots in the remake that play with shadows in the same way that the 32 film did. And it was a hit. It made over 4 times its $80 million budget. So a sequel was put into production almost immediately. And they called that The Mummy Returns. Unlike the sequels that followed the 1932 film, this was a direct continuation, with Imhotep coming back for revenge, but it also added an extra threat, the Scorpion King, played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in his first real film role. At the time, I felt both good and bad for The Rock, because even in his short screen time, he did have presence, and it's just the start of his film career that continues to this day, as he's working right now on making a Black Adam movie for Warner Brothers and DC, and making the Disney Jungle Cruise movie, which honestly I'm excited about because I love the Jungle Cruise because I'm a weird theme park nerd. But I also felt kind of bad for him because he seems to get less screen time than this thing that stole his face. Like, this effect is shockingly bad, even for 2001. It's probably the worst effect in the entire movie. It just feels rushed and not up to par with every other effect in the film. It's like everything else is relatively real looking, even when you know it's fake. And suddenly, at the end, they're fighting the end boss of a 90s video game. That said, The Mummy Returns holds up. It's still fun. It isn't just a rehash of the same story, and it builds off of it and goes even bigger. Rachel Weisz as Evie gets a lot more to do in this. Like, she's the brains in the first one, but rarely gets involved in the action. In this, she's less damsel, more active participant, which is an improvement. And she has a couple of really good fight scenes where she gets to do some badassery. The Mummy Returns had a slightly higher budget, but again made over 4 times that in box office. The spin-off prequel, The Scorpion King, was quickly put out with a $60 million budget and made 3 times that, becoming the thing that really launched The Rock's film career. It was his first real starring role. The Scorpion King is definitely its own thing with its own tone. If the Mummy remake owed a lot to Indiana Jones, the Scorpion King owes just as much to Conan the Barbarian. It's a very sword and sorcery kind of movie, much more so. It was co-produced by the WWE, and I will let that fact just sit there without commentary. The Scorpion King spawned 4 direct-to-video sequels with various other actors in the title role, and in a shocking turn, 4 direct-to-video sequels are not good, but that last one was released in 2018, just 2 years ago, so they'll keep squeezing that lemon for as long as they can, I guess. The Mummy franchise made one more sequel, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, which for some reason moves the action to China and has a scene where our heroes are saved by a group of Yeti. Honestly, the less said about this movie, the better. Rachel Weisz couldn't return due to scheduling conflicts, so they just recast her with a different actress. They probably should have just viewed that as a sign and not made it. Apparently, Brendan Fraser, during the making of Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, injured himself doing stunts badly enough that he was doing various surgeries for about 7 years to try to correct things and heal. Now, regardless of all this, the Tomb of the Dragon Emperor still made $400 million. It made actually less money than the previous 2 sequels, even though it had a much higher budget. A further sequel was planned. This time it was going to be dealing with the Aztecs, and they were going to have Antonio Banderas as the villain. And honestly, I would have liked to have seen that, but they never made it because Universal instead decided to scrap all of that, and in 2017 released a complete reboot titled again The Mummy, starring Tom Cruise. They intended for it to be the beginning of a cinematic universe that would include reboots of other classic Universal monsters like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Bride of Frankenstein, etc. But instead, it was so poorly received that Universal ended their plans for a shared dark universe in 2019, with The Mummy being the first and last film of that series.
So dark!
So, what can we learn from this about remakes? One of 2 things. Either The Mummy as a franchise truly is cursed, or more likely, don't do a remake unless you have a love of the source material and a great idea. And if you can't get your actors back for a sequel, maybe skip it. I hope you've enjoyed my rambling. If you have an idea for something else I should cover, leave it in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for coming to my meltdown. Bye!